It's a world-famous New York City establishment with an almost magical place in entertainment history. With Alina Cho, our room is waiting at the Hotel Chelsea.
Outside the hotel today, two punk rock fans showed up, saying they are in mourning, but not for the 28-year-old girl Vicious allegedly killed.
I'm in mourning for Sid today. I really feel sorry for him more than for the girl.
I didn't like her.
Nancy was a hooker that was on the coattails of the New York Dolls. And I actually introduced her to Sid, and shame on me.
No, they were really very much in love. Well, I thought so. And they were very pleasant, nice people.
That'll rip your balls off.
This young man is lead guitarist of a New York punk rock group called The Rippers. Their act includes ripping off their shirts on stage, and the lead singer actually cuts himself with a scalpel as part of the routine. The musician walked out a newspaper account of the murder and then spoke about it.
I saw her walking right up the street yesterday. If I didn't know better, I'd say it was a publicity stunt, you know? It's totally a mental case.
I think that probably he was, you know, like it was part of his image, and he got so involved in his image that he just would beat on her, maybe. But I really don't think he could stab her.
Why?
Because he was so weak, his little hands could hardly hold the microphone. It's true, it really is. If you ever saw him, you'd know his hands just dangled weakly.
Why did you like him and his music? What was there that you admired if he was so weak?
I like weak men.
No, I couldn't take them off. My nose is broken, I'm keeping them on.
I didn't want anything to do with her.
We did everything to get rid of Nancy that was physically possible.
He didn't like me because I was a junkie. He tried to keep me and Sid apart for months. Months.
It was just a dark cloud with this bird, and I fucking hated her.
Sup, sobers? One of New York City's first cooperative housing projects, which was built in 1884 by Philip Hubert, was the Chelsea Hotel. At 12 stories, approximately 180 feet tall, held New York City's tallest building record all the way up until 1899. It was essentially this utopian apartment complex that would attract people from all different walks of life, all different professions. You've got laborers, artists, actors, actresses that should come here, collaborate, encourage, diversity as well as collaboration between these industries to come up with some new stuff and come up with, new ways of doing things or new ideas or collaboration projects. Before the internet, in the 1800s, this is how they had to do things. Tenants would all share the responsibility of splitting costs of fuel and different services, which, we see that in a lot of apartment complexes now. But this was one of the first concepts where people were all paying into one giant pool or pot for all of the amenities and services they get with the whole apartment complex. And it was running strong all the way up until 1905, when they finally had to turn it into a hotel because of financial struggles. But because of the reputation that it already had, it turned into this historic place that people all wanted to visit and stay at. They wanted to see what's all the hype about, really. In fact, the Chelsea Hotel has been a temporary home for some majorly huge names, some of which I find very interesting that they're all on this same list. But I'm just going to go through and read this list to you guys. There's too many names to remember. We've got Mark Twain, Arthur Miller, Jack Kerouac, Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Patti Smith, Robert Mapplethorpe, I don't know who that is, Andy Warhol, Jackson Pollock, William S. Burroughs, Thomas Wolfe, Eddie Sedgwick, Sid Vicious, Nancy Spungen, Madonna, Ethan Hawke, and many others. It's become this cultural icon of a place, especially since so many famous people who have suddenly disappeared or met tragic endings, they all stayed here. And there is a string of random, strange disappearances within the hotel itself that give it even more mystique, even more intrigue. In 1908, a young girl named Almira Wilcox actually OD'd on some sleeping pills in her room at the Chelsea Hotel, marking one of the earliest tragedies that they had documented anyways. In 1909, an artist named Frank Kavecki had some Hungarian Sick and Benevolent Society funds that I don't know if he was like earning them or was just holding on to them, but they got stolen from him. And because of this financial loss, he ended up self-exiting up in his room at the Chelsea Hotel. In 1922, the wife of a concert pianist, Atelka Graf, she decided one night, randomly, to chop off her left hand and then launch herself from the 5th-story window. Unfortunately, she didn't make it. In 1953, Welsh poet Dylan Thomas came into the hotel boasting about how he just went down to the White Horse Tavern and just chugged 18 whiskeys. Then shortly after that, he slipped into a coma and then passed away 4 days later from pneumonia. Suspicious, but it all happened at the Chelsea Hotel. In 1966, Edie Sedgwick, who was an Andy Warhol muse, like in his films and art stuff, was staying at the hotel, and she accidentally must have fallen asleep or something and lit the hotel room on fire with a candle. So she survived, but she definitely sustained some burns, and yet another mysteriously weird tragedy at the Chelsea Hotel. Then 2 years later, in 1968, the author of the book The Lost Weekend, Charles R. Jackson, was found dead in his hotel room after leaving his gas stove on, and he supposedly died of carbon monoxide poisoning. And they say that it's probably related to his intense struggles with alcoholism. Then sometime in the late 1970s, glam rock photographer Billy Maynard was staying in the hotel when he was found bludgeoned to death in his hotel room, and to this day, the case remains unsolved. Yet another eerie mystery at the Chelsea Hotel. Then, on October 18th in 1978, a random, mysterious, unexplained fire breaks out in the hotel, damaging multiple rooms, displacing multiple tenants. The fire, unfortunately, they never figure out what started it. Thankfully, nobody was hurt in the fire, but there's a lot of speculation because of the timing of the fire, as well as the placement of the fire, that this might have been some sort of arson or a cover-up. But what would they be covering up, you might be wondering? Well, to figure that out, we've got to go down to room 100 at the Chelsea Hotel.
Let's go.
Welcome back to Sobering Stories with me, DJ Petrovski. If this is your first time here, thanks for giving me a try. I'd recommend you hit that subscribe button, smash that like button, drop a comment down below, share this video with your friends and family members, make a post on social media about this channel and about how you just found this channel and you subscribed, and then that should be it. Yeah, that should be all. That's all you got to do. If you're a returning viewer, sup sobers. Also, share this video with 50 to 60 of your closest friends and family members. Honestly, I feel like I haven't seen or talked with you guys in a really long time. I've been off for the last 4 weeks, and my buddy Kurt Cobain has been filling in for me, so I really appreciate that, and I just want to give him a huge shout out. Thanks for being there for me so I could take some time off, recoup, come back, and be ready to rock and roll. But yeah, if you haven't seen those Kurt Cobain episodes that Kirk did, I would highly recommend you go check those out. I am proud of that series, and I mean, I'm proud of all my videos, but that one in particular, I'm just proud of everything that went into it. So check it out. Our only business item this week is going to be the sponsor, and the sponsor this week is one that we've had on the channel in the past, and this sponsor continues to support the channel week in and week out, 24/7, all the time. And that's going to be me because, well, I'm still doing everything in terms of all the work, but I got some new merch stuff in, not only the Sup Sobers Sobering Stories t-shirts that you can get from the link in my bio, but I also have been wanting to get one of these cool Sober Sector bags, and I am in love with it. It's just as cool as I thought it would be. It's like a little side satchel bag. I love it. I designed it myself, and for a lot of you guys, you may not know this, but I started my channel off as just like a sober help channel, and I called it the Sober Sector, And I designed all this cool merch with that in mind, and then now it's kind of like it doesn't make a lot of sense. But they're still cool designs, and I still love it, and it's still my handle, so I kept it. But anyways, I just really appreciate this inside. Look at that little YouTube logo with me. It says DJ Petrovski. It's kind of cool. But yeah, it's a super sick bag. I would highly recommend the bag if you're interested in getting something like this. It's got DJ Petrovski on the bottom. And yeah, it just says Sober Sector all the way around it. But we got this one as well. I got one for Kim. Got the YouTube logo on there. Yeah, I don't know. I think they're sick. You can also grab one of the Sub Sobers hats, Sub Sobers t-shirt. There's all kinds of Sub Sober stuff. One of which is like a paddleboard, like a SUP stand-up paddleboard t-shirt that says Sub Sobers, which I think is pretty funny. But anyways, yeah, I just wanted to mention that because I don't talk about the merch enough. And if you want to get some, you can get some. Click the link. It's all you. Now, I think the parallels between the Kurt Cobain case and the Nancy and Sid case are pretty obvious. I mean, even Courtney Love idolized Nancy Spungen just purely out of what she was, what she stood for. And if you think about the two trajectories of these girls, they're almost identical, like literally almost exactly the same. And it's very interesting to see such parallels and such similarities in their story, especially knowing how everything ended for both of them. Courtney Love also auditioned for the role of Nancy Spungen in the Sid Nancy movie. She wasn't chosen for the main role of Nancy, but she did get a supporting role of like one of the friends who was strung out in the movie. So she at least got on the set.
Hi. Hello.
It was...
You know what? You should pick me for Nancy. I mean, there's nobody else. I'm not going to leave you alone. You could create one of the greatest artists of this generation. Me. Don't put me in your movie.
Kurt and Courtney's relationship was also very similar to Sid and Nancy's in that they were both fueled by very tumultuous situations, lots of abuse, certainly lots of addiction, and more than anything, codependency, likely because of their addictions. And another thing I found quite interesting was how in both cases, after Sid and Kurt's passings, it marked the death of an era. Once Kurt passed, it's almost like grunge was no longer, I don't know, it just wasn't really as popular, it didn't hit as hard, and it kind of faded out shortly after that. The same could be said for punk music. Shortly after Sid Vicious had passed, punk music started to fade away, at least out of the spotlight anyways. Of course, there's still underground niche communities for all these different genres now, but at the time, these genres and this era was heavily focused around these different styles of music, and they were heavily influential on the young minds and the culture of the time. So it's kind of interesting that both of them suddenly passed away at very young ages, and then ultimately this whole movement, this whole mindset, this whole era of counterculture kids were left with nowhere to go. And it makes sense why there's so many similarities between the two genres, because most grunge artists will specifically mention that a lot of punk bands were their inspiration for them moving in this grunge direction, but obviously wanting to do things a little bit differently. And that's probably due to the fact that punk was slowly on the downhill and this new grunge style was on the uphill.
I was commuting back and forth between Aberdeen and Montesano. I was living in Aberdeen, and I was going to school in Montesano, which is about 30 miles away. And I had Buzz in a couple of classes. I had him in an art class and an electronics class, and I remember just hanging out with him, and just he had a few punk rock magazines, and I would look at them and just like, oh, I was just mesmerized, you know. I was just like, oh God, what would that sound like? And finally one day I convinced him to make me a tape.
So you were a long time wondering about what it would be like before you actually heard it then?
Oh, for years, ever since I was like 12, like that issue of Cream magazine when they were following the Sex Pistols tour, you know, in '78, you know. I remember seeing that picture of Sid Vicious and just going, oh wow, that's real rock and roll. It has to be. Look at the blood on his face, you know.
Also, in both cases, Sid and Kurt were essentially considered the face of that style of music. Kurt was the face of grunge, And Sid Vicious was definitely the face of punk. And when you think of Kurt Cobain and when you think of Sid Vicious, it's nearly impossible for you to think of these two names without them being accompanied by Courtney Love and Nancy Spungen. It's certainly not unheard of, but it isn't very normal for the spouse or the wife or girlfriend of any particular celebrity or musician to be as famous as the person that's the celebrity or musician or whatever. But in both of these cases, Courtney Love and Nancy Spungen were honestly maybe more famous than the guys that they were with. And the controversy that surrounds both cases is of course very interesting. But in order to figure out what happened in room 100 at the Chelsea Hotel, we've got to figure out what led to Nancy getting involved in such a crazy, wild punk rock genre of music and being one of the huge faces of this era. Also, Courtney Love looks exactly like Nancy Spungen. And Courtney openly talks about how she idolizes and aspires to be Nancy Spungen. I don't even think she wants to be like her. I think she actually wants to be her. But she mimics her in very much her actions, her addiction, her no-nonsense attitude, as well as her motives and her drive to force her way into the music industry, and then suddenly ends up with the face of that era, the face of that genre. It's crazy that these two stories are so similar, and it's crazy that Courtney Love literally looks exactly like Nancy Spungen. Nancy Laura Spungen was born on February 27th, 1958, to parents Frank and Deborah Spungen. She was the oldest of 3 kids, and they were just a middle-class Jewish family living in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. When Nancy was born, she had the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck, which caused her to be without oxygen to her brain for quite a while. Now, this lack of oxygen to your brain when you're a freshly newborn baby is extremely detrimental and can lead to very serious mental illnesses later on down the line. The other thing about this situation is that she had to be transferred to the ICU for babies, the NICU, and she was held there for a few days before Deborah or Frank got to hold her, see her, meet her, anything. Literally, I could not imagine if I couldn't even see my brand new baby right after they were born. Not even for a second. It's just crazy. But on a more scientific note, it's proven that babies who don't have a chance to immediately bond with their mother right after birth certainly exhibit more behavioral, personality, and just mental issues as they grow older, because they don't have that ability to attach as easily as someone who is immediately bonded with their mother right after birth. So there is science to support the fact that her being kept from her parents for so long probably had lasting traumatic effects. So I don't know. It's definitely a rough start, that's for sure. To make things even more stressful on the Spungens, Nancy was born with a different blood type from her mom. Because her mom had Rh negative blood and Nancy had Rh positive blood, the mom's blood was actually attacking Nancy's blood cells, which was cause for immediate blood transfusions. And so Nancy was still being kept away from her parents and probably undergoing all of these really uncomfortable and painful procedures, having needles and stuff all stuck inside of her. It just sounds like a really rough start to life. Because of her ABO blood incompatibility with her mom, Nancy was extremely jaundiced. She was cyanotic, which means she was really blue. And she also just screamed all the time. She never stopped screaming. In the NICU with all the other calm, quiet, sleeping babies, there was one in the back corner that was Nancy, just screaming at the top of her lungs. And it was so bad that even the nursing staff could not help. They couldn't get control of her. They thought maybe she was hungry, maybe she needed something, maybe whatever, but they were never able to calm her down. Originally, the doctors told the Spungens that Nancy would have to undergo multiple blood transfusions, but they only ended up having to do one. And I read somewhere that the doctors realized at a certain point that they were wrong about the blood types and they ended up stopping the procedure. But I've also read other reports that said that she only needed the one procedure. So I'm not 100% sure about that aspect of things. But according to Deborah Spungen in her book, she says that they only required one transfusion. So maybe that's what she knew. I'm not sure. But they were allowed to take her home much sooner than anticipated. It was only a few days. They were finally able to hold their daughter, see their daughter, finally meet and bond with their new baby daughter. Unfortunately for the Spungens, the screaming never went away. And it was more than your typical infant crying, screaming, because everybody knows that infants cry and scream, and that's the only way they can communicate. So it wasn't out of the norm for that to be happening. But the amount, literally, it was all day. Nancy would scream when she woke up. She would scream when she ate. She would scream when she wasn't doing anything. She would scream when she went to bed. She would scream all day long.
She didn't just cry, she screamed. She screamed night and she screamed day. And it was really a cry of pain or of anguish, and nothing seemed to quiet her. She never slept for periods of more than 2 hours. At the age of 4 or 5 months, when you went to cuddle her in your arms, she would stiffen her body and push against you and scream. She didn't like to be held. And it was just so very difficult.
After a certain point, Deborah and Frank were like, we've got to see if something's wrong with her. Is our baby broke or what? So they take her in, and the doctors are like, oh no, it's pretty normal. It might just be a phase. Maybe she's reacting poorly to your milk. Maybe it's your milk or like your anxiety levels that are causing her to be stressed out. So it's obviously the mom's fault that this is happening. The doctors seem very quick to try and put the blame back onto the parents. Like, it must be something that you guys are doing that's causing her to scream like this. In a good measure effort, they go ahead and prescribe, at 3 months old, phenobarbital, which is like a mild barbiturate. And typically they only use this for kids who have seizures or in necessary situations. It's not just to like mess around and give babies this stuff. In fact, it wasn't very common for babies to be taking this stuff. At 3 months old, she was already being given these chemicals, these different toxins, these drugs to try and help her be normal. When this stuff failed to help Nancy with her violent screaming and outbursts, then the parents took her back in and were like, this stuff isn't really helping. So they told her to give it to her every 4 hours, and they increased the dose. And typically people who are taking this medication are taking it like once or twice a day, but every 4 hours as a 3-month-old baby, this is crazy to me. As Nancy got older, she experienced a number of different problems, starting with the fact that one of her legs was fairly deformed, and she actually had to wear a leg brace as she was learning to crawl and walk around, just dragging this little leg brace around so that her leg would grow and develop normally in the right direction so she didn't have walking issues. Anytime that Deborah tried to, cuddle or snuggle or comfort Nancy in any way, Nancy would completely stiffen up, like every muscle in her whole body would just go stiff.
Oh, Ricky.
And she would just seem so awkwardly uncomfortable, like she just could not handle the affection. So that was extremely concerning for Deborah. As Nancy learned to talk, she developed a stuttering issue. And she also had this weird issue where she couldn't keep her tongue in her mouth. It just would stay out of her mouth for long periods of time, I guess. But these were all very concerning to Deborah and Frank. They just had no idea what was going on. So Deborah takes Nancy back into the doctor and is just asking, what's going on with my child? This doesn't seem like normal behavior. Is there some sort of mental disability or some sort of mental issue we need to deal with? Because this phenobarbital stuff is not helping. It's getting worse. And the doctor just says, oh, it's just a phase. She'll fade out of it. Don't worry. It's nothing to worry about. Really, what we should do is just increase her dose of this phenobarbital.
You sought professional help. What kind of advice did you get?
The first time we took her to a psychiatric clinic was at the age of 3.5. We had mentioned to pediatricians before that we felt there was a problem. They said, love her, channel her, guide her, she'll outgrow it. She's just very bright. When we took her to the first clinic, at the end of 6 months, they discharged us and said, if you have further problems, bring her back. We really got no useful advice, nor did we ever get a diagnosis nor a prognosis. I'd say that the cry in the first 10 or 12 years was always that, love her, channel her. And I couldn't imagine what they thought we had been doing.
So she's now been on this stuff since she was 3 months old, and it's been 2 or 3 years at this point. She's been consistently taking this medication. According to Deborah, as early as 2 years old, she was already making threats to Deborah, making threats to babysitters and nannies that they had around. She even went as far as to make a threat and start punching on this telephone repair guy who was coming over just to disconnect the phone lines because they were moving houses. Nancy was freaking out, banging on this guy, just like, hey, reconnect my phones, put it back, put it back. Now, I don't know how valid any of this stuff from Deborah really is, because some of this stuff as a 2-year-old, I just don't see it happening. But I will say that Nancy was extremely smart. Eventually, we would find out that Nancy has a genius-level IQ. This was a good thing because obviously she's intelligent, but intelligent people are also able to manipulate things a lot better than other people. And this is certainly the case with Nancy. She was extremely manipulative as a child, and then that continued to progress and get worse as she got older. Now, in 1959, when Nancy's sister Susan was born, things got way worse, likely because the attention was no longer on Nancy. And she just took out all of this frustration on her little sister. And once her little sister was starting to walk, she would push her down. She would just be awful to her all the time. These violent tendencies, coupled with the nonstop screaming and all of the other weird mental issues that she seemed to be having, really led Deborah to want to take her back into the doctor. But this time, she was trying to go see a psychiatrist as opposed to the typical pediatrician. Obviously, they weren't helping. None of the things they'd offered were doing anything. And they seemed to just brush her off each and every time she went into the doctor's office to try and get help with what's going on with her daughter. So Deborah asked Frank, like, yo, do you think we should bring Nancy into a psychiatrist? And at that time, they were probably called a shrink. And people hated the idea of going to a shrink, because if you went to a shrink or a psychiatrist or cared at all about your mental health, then you were labeled as like a paranoid schizophrenic psycho. So with this in mind, Frank, of course, denies. He says, no, there's no way we're taking our daughter into a psychiatrist. We're not having our daughter's head shrunk. We're not doing any of that. No way. Deborah talks about how Frank likely had no idea the extent of the issues Nancy was having because he was typically at work. So he wasn't there to experience all of this stuff. And he would also get involved with activities outside of work, just things to get him out of the house and away from the drama that was going on with Nancy. But because he was gone all the time, he had no idea the extent of these issues. So of course he's not going to want his daughter to go to some shrink, and of course he's not going to think she has any issues. But that all changed one day when Nancy was talking about wanting to go to the circus. Her dad was like, cool, yeah, that sounds like fun. We should totally go to the circus. So as they get loaded up in the car, Nancy starts freaking out. She's like, I don't want to go. It's too far. But her dad's like, no, we should go. There's going to be tons of fun things to do. It's the circus. It's going to be great. Finally, she decides like, okay, yeah, we should definitely go. Then a few minutes later, she flips a switch again and she's screaming, no, I don't want to go. It's too far. No, I don't want to go. Frank finally gets this dose of what Nancy is really like. And he is overwhelmed and he is unfamiliar with how to handle this situation. And this is what finally convinces him that they should probably seek professional psychiatric help for Nancy. So at 4 years old, Nancy is starting to see a counselor. She sees this counselor twice a month. They, of course, start doing all these different tests on her, trying to analyze, just trying to see like what is going on with this girl. One of the things they do is they perform an IQ test. Now, Deborah and Frank had come in saying that they thought she might have some sort of psychological issues that might stem from the fact that when she was born, she had all of these issues, including having the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. The likelihood that those were the reasons for these issues seems pretty high. The counselor's like, no, she actually tested really high. Her IQ is off the charts. She scored a 134, which I think genius Mensa levels is 132. So she was in the genius range. But because she tested so high and her IQ is so high, we don't think that she experienced any sort of brain damage or any sort of psychological trauma that might be causing these issues. But this doesn't make any sense because people who exhibit psychopathy and sociopathy, they are typically really smart. In fact, Courtney Love, if we go back to our Kurt Cobain series, Courtney Love exhibited the same exact symptoms. She was extraordinarily smart, but she was also exhibiting signs of psychopathy, and she seemed to be a sociopath, maybe even a pathological liar. The fact that she's smart doesn't negate the fact that she could also have psychological damage. Not to mention the trauma she experienced being a newborn baby distanced from her parents for so long. Probably the strangest thing about Nancy's childhood is that she would go through these periods where she would be just absolutely awful, and then she would have these periods where she was an angel. Deborah says that unlike Susan, once her brother David was born, she had a complete change of tune. She was suddenly super helpful, asking what she could do around the house, asking what she could do to help, and she just absolutely doted on her little brother. But, of course, that only lasted a couple of weeks, and then things went right back to the same old, screaming, throwing tantrums, being violent, just being completely uncontrollable. Now, Nancy's constantly switching moods is very indicative of schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder, but that got even more solidified when Deborah was completely caught off guard by Nancy standing at the top of the stairs with this brown bag in her hands. And she's like, "Nancy, what are you doing with that? Like, what's in the bag?" And she just says, "Aquarius." And Aquarius is the name of their cat. So Deborah's like, "What are you doing with Aquarius in that bag?" And Nancy, kind of just cold and very distant, very stale, says, "Well, I'm going to throw him down the stairs and see if he lands on his feet." And Deborah's like, "No, you're not going to do that. He's going to get hurt." And so she went up and tried to talk her out of throwing this cat down the stairs in this bag. And then out of nowhere, she comes out of this stone-like state, and she doesn't even know what's going on. She doesn't understand why Aquarius is in this bag. She doesn't understand what's happening. It's like she completely blacked out and was taken over by a whole entirely different person. Now, things would not only get worse for Nancy, but they would also get worse for her parents, because they were dealing with so much drama and so many issues within the household, and they were so focused on what they had to do for their children as opposed to taking care of themselves. They didn't have any time to foster the relationship they had with each other, and instead, they just isolated from each other. And like I mentioned before, Frank would be out doing his own thing. He started getting involved in extra activities. He started doing more so that he did not have to be at home dealing with Nancy and all of the issues that come along with caring for Nancy. Because Frank was always gone, Deborah started accusing him of cheating on her, kind of in retaliation against the fact that she thought he was cheating on her. She went out and had her own affair. Come to find out, he was never cheating on her in the first place. Eventually, he would go on to cheat on her, and it just created this really toxic relationship to the point where they started discussing getting a divorce. But something completely unheard of for that time period, the two of them decided to sit down, hash it out, lay it all out on the table, talk about their feelings, their experience with this whole Nancy situation, and discuss what they thought would be the best thing to move forward. They decided that they were going to stay together, they were going to figure out this issue with Nancy, and they were going to fight through this, despite all of their issues, which I absolutely commend them for that, especially because I've been through a similar situation and I know how hard it is to build that trust back up, to earn trust again, and to also kind of overcome the trauma that you've experienced in the relationship. The two of them loved each other. They didn't want anybody else. And honestly, if they would have separated, it would have been even worse for Nancy, in my opinion. But this prompts Frank and Deborah to think that maybe it's the city life, maybe it's the city kids, maybe it's the kids at her school, maybe it's just something about the city that's causing all of her, all of her issues, her to act out like she does. So they decide to pack up and move out to the suburbs. And when they move, they end up having to find a new counselor for Nancy. And when she starts seeing this new counselor, they kind of do what all, counselors / psychiatrists, therapists do. They go back through all the stuff that you already have done with your original therapist or your original psychiatrist. And this is exactly what happens with Nancy. They start performing all the same tests. They realize, yes, she does have an extremely high IQ, but they also find that she's emotionally depraved. She seems to be craving emotional connection, and she just can't get it. So yet again, the doctors, psychiatrists, therapists, they continue to put blame back onto the Spungens. They say, you're not giving her the emotional attention that she needs. You're not there to give her the things that she needs to feel emotionally satisfied. Now, I want to take us back to the beginning of our story, where we learn that Nancy was not able to bond with her mom or her dad for the first few days of her life. Typically, that is going to lead to issues with creating bonds with people in general, not just your mom and dad. You are unable to create these meaningful bonds because you missed out on that crucial bonding period where you truly feel emotionally safe. I don't know, you're just emotionally bonding with your mom in that moment. And this inability to bond was very obvious because Nancy had never been good at making friends, and she didn't really have that many friends in general. Unfortunately, things would only get worse from here. At the age of 11, Nancy started experiencing more and more of these trance-like states, like when she was holding her cat Aquarius in the bag, and these outbursts and these reactions to things would get so violent and so crazy. At one point, she had dropped some of her beads from a bracelet she was making with her friends in the neighborhood, and because she couldn't find this one bead in the grass that had fallen, she completely lost control, started screaming, and her mom had to do her best to try and restrain her just to keep her calm. These violent outbursts would happen very regularly at this point. Another evening, Deborah heard some loud noises, some banging sounds, and some screaming going on from Nancy's bedroom. So she ran up there to see what was going on, and she found Nancy banging her head against the wall, pulling her hair out, just being crazy destructive. She was throwing everything in her room, just destroying it. There was nothing that they could really do except for try and restrain her and keep her calm. She would go from this to then randomly just being super happy and calm and singing, and then right back into violently screaming, throwing her hands around, causing destruction around her, back and forth between these two extremes. Her dad and her mom ended up having to stay with her all night that night in her room, just taking turns kind of restraining her, making sure she doesn't hurt herself, because they were very worried she might do something to hurt herself. And they were right, because as things progressed, Nancy would continue to make these random threats about self-exiting. She would constantly tell her parents oh, you don't love me, and she would try and steal all of their old prescription medications in the cabinets and threaten to take them all. And just all of these different threats that she's making are really freaking her parents out, and they don't know what to do at this point. Deborah had called Nancy's therapist and explained the situation to her and was like, what do we do? I have no idea what to do. We're at a loss. And her therapist was like, oh, she's just trying to get attention. You should have just ignored her. Don't play into her attention-seeking behaviors. And her parents are like, okay, but how do we do that? She's literally pulling her hair out. She's literally banging her head into a wall. She's causing physical harm to herself. We can't just let her keep doing that. So the therapist just seems to brush them off yet again and blames the parents for what's going on with Nancy because they're just not doing the right thing. They're not reacting the right way. The therapist doesn't seem to be taking it seriously or think that it's a real issue. It doesn't become a real issue until at the next therapy session, Nancy completely destroys the therapist's office and calls her a bunch of names and just, makes her problems very well known to the therapist. At which point the therapist realizes, okay, you guys were serious. This is actually a very serious issue. And Nancy was only getting bigger, stronger, more violent, more manipulative. It got so crazy that Deborah recounts one night when Nancy wanted to go to some science museum or some science thing, and she was telling her hey, we should go now, and Deborah was like, we can't. They're about to close in 30 minutes. There's no point. We can't go. And Nancy got super mad and was demanding that they leave and go, and Deborah's like, no, we can't. They're gonna close. So Nancy grabbed a hammer that was nearby. Apparently her brother was doing some work with it earlier, and she proceeds to hit her mom 3 times with it in the shoulder. Of course, this is another level of her outbursts, of her violence, and it was definitely cause for her to be sent somewhere to get some professional help, be in a controlled setting with professionals who can monitor her and give her the tools she needs to cope with life. Because of Nancy's behavior at school, she was eventually kicked out of her school. Her therapist, after that last outburst, realized she's not equipped to handle this. So she said that she needs to seek other help because she can't do it anymore. And this really left the Spungens at a real loss. What do we do now? And they tried real hard searching around for different schools and different psychiatrists that would take Nancy in. And they were having a real hard time doing that, especially because I'm sure all these psychiatrists in the industry probably talk, or she has a file with all of the stuff that she's done listed out. So I'm sure it was very hard for her to be accepted by anyone new. Things were getting really bad for Deb and Frank because Nancy was going through these periods where it almost seemed like she was a completely different person. During one of her crazy screaming, singing outbursts, right in the middle of everything, she kind of stops and realizes, like, who are you guys? Oh, wait, you're that really nice lady from last night, and you're that really nice man from last night. It sounds like she's talking to her parents as if she's never met them, which is kind of strange. But the final straw for both Deb and Frank was when they caught Nancy in this same trance-like state, gathering up all of the knives in the kitchen. Deb asks her, like, what are you doing with all those knives? And she's like, I'm going to stab them. And she says, who? And then she says, the brother and the sister, which is such a weird, disconnected, third-person way to refer to your siblings. So that to me was almost confirmation she's experiencing schizophrenia and probably multiple personalities. After searching around for a new school for a while, they finally were able to find this place in Connecticut. Now, this school was more like a group home. They had a bunch of, I think, like 20 kids that all lived together, did schooling together, and then they had their own individual therapy sessions, group therapy sessions, but they had professionals on site that could help Nancy anytime she needed it. And this is the kind of professional care that I think she needed, and she absolutely loved the school. The whole first year that she went there, she enjoyed her time, she started making serious progress. There was a ton of behavioral changes, and I think that that all stemmed from her really finding a groove and finding connection with these other kids. Unfortunately, when Nancy went back for her second year, the original owners or operators of the school got transferred to a different location. Because they were no longer there, the new operators decided that Nancy wasn't really a good fit for the school, and they transferred her to a different school. And this school was mostly the same, but it was with older kids. And obviously, when she's hanging out with older kids, especially a lot of delinquent older kids, then it makes sense that this is when she started dabbling in different drugs. At this point, Nancy was totally letting loose and seemingly doing everything she could to rebel. She was now doing drugs, she was dating boys, and she had also lost her virginity. She started dating a guy named Jeff. He was 1 year older than her, and he was in a band. He played guitar. So, of course, she was immediately drawn to him, and everything seemed to be going well, but at some point she thought that she might be pregnant with Jeff's baby, and she was way too young for this and did not want to deal with that, so she decided to give herself an old school, at-home, hanger-style abortion. And this did not go well because she actually punctured her uterus, and she hemorrhaged really badly, and she bled out all over the place, and luckily a counselor found her and she was rushed to the hospital, so of course she made it okay, but it did not seem like this school was really helping. In fact, it made it seem like she was actually regressing. She became a real serious cutter, on top of using all these drugs, and just being totally irresponsible, and honestly, she was dangerous at this point. They couldn't trust that she wasn't going to harm herself. Especially knowing that that was one of her manipulation tactics that she would frequently use, is harming herself to get her way, or threatening to self-exit in order to get her way. So they just didn't know what to do, but there wasn't a lot of other schools or places that would take Nancy, so they felt really stuck. Even their rabbi was at a loss for what to do. They just said, I don't really know where to send her, I don't know what place would accept her, I'm really at a loss here, I'm sorry. Around this same time, Deborah finds this doctor named Dr. Cott, and he is a big deal in the medical field, especially when it comes to mental health and psychiatric disorders. And he agrees to see the Spungens, and he has a little questionnaire, and it asks all these different questions of things that Nancy has been doing her entire life. And the conclusion that he comes to is that Nancy has likely been over-medicated, which is causing all of these issues. So not only did the doctors fail the Spungens by not providing any sort of information on what might actually be wrong with their daughter, but they also over-medicated her for so long that she's now permanently kind of messed up in the head.
Is not much different today, the situation of here's a child who's very ill and probably will end either in a mental institution, in jail, or dead. And the doctors perhaps were frustrated by the fact that they could not offer us any concrete advice. I asked one doctor, she was about 11 at the time, what should we do? And he looked at me and he said, darned if I know. So I think they were frustrated because they had no doctor to refer us to. They had no hospital to refer us to. and no hope. And the rest of her life, when we took her to a doctor or had her committed to a hospital, they would say, "You might as well take her home. She's much too sick. You've waited too long."
It's not until much, much later that Deborah actually finds out that all of the doctors that she had spoken with over the years did have elaborate notes about what could be wrong with her, especially Nancy's most recent psychiatrist. He seemed to have a pretty good idea of the fact that she might be a child schizophrenic.
I think that the doctors were dishonest with us. It's only in the last 2 years when I had some of her medical reports or psychiatric reports released to us did I really find out that a number of doctors thought that she was quite ill mentally, that she was possibly a childhood schizophrenic, and there was also a possibility of a brain tumor, and that a neurological examination was indicated by doctors, but none of this information was ever relayed to us.
But because they thought that she might just grow out of it, because that is something that happens, sometimes these kids grow out of their schizophrenic tendencies and they're able to mature and move in a different path just naturally. But because that never happened for Nancy, you would have thought that they would have taken some action at some point. But no, they were still holding out hope that it would just fix itself, I guess. Now, Dr. Cott was more than willing to treat Nancy. But in order to do that, it was going to take a solid month of time. He would have to continuously monitor her. He would have to regulate her diet. And he was also big on promoting these different vitamins, which would help your body be in its prime state so that you could almost heal yourself. And of course, there would be multiple therapy hours that would be needed. And so it was going to take a solid month that she would have to take off of school to be able to do this. So Deb and Frank approached the school and were like, "Hey, this is the situation. We found this doctor. He can help Nancy. We just need to know if we can take a solid month off and still hold our space here." And they essentially said, like, "No, that doctor's a quack. He's just trying to sell you vitamins. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I wouldn't listen to him. And essentially, if you go see this doctor and take that month off, you will no longer have your place at this school. We will have to give it to the next person in line and you'll be put back on the waiting list." So they didn't know what to do. They're like, do we go see this doctor and risk her losing her spot at the school, or do we stay at the school? So they asked Dr. Cott what they should do. And he said, in good conscience, I can't do something that would jeopardize her future. And if she doesn't have that school, then she has nowhere else to go. So I don't want to treat her if it means that she's going to lose out on anything. So they decide to leave her at that school. And unfortunately, this would be a huge mistake. But one of the last things that Dr. Cott tells them is that she is at super high risk of abusing drugs as an adult. Because she has this long history of being overly medicated, it's going to be very hard for her without the proper tools and therapy and training to be able to cope with life and the struggles and issues she's going to face in a healthy manner, not using drugs. So this really sucks for Nancy. But even worse for her, she stays at this school, and very shortly after that, the heads of the school want to try and get her out. So they decide, "Oh, Nancy, you're so smart. Like, we should get you out of here. We need to get you prepped for college." So they start making her take her SAT tests and submit college applications, essentially just trying to force her out the door. But Nancy doesn't want to leave. She finally feels included somewhere. She's enjoying her time at school, and she's not ready to go yet. In response to this, she tries to self-exit by severing some of the veins that go up and down her arm using a razor blade. It was so bad she had to get 21 stitches, and the doctors said that if she would have been there for any longer than she was and not been found by her friend at that school, then she probably wouldn't be here anymore. Now, despite not wanting to leave school, Nancy was accepted to the University of Colorado at Boulder, which isn't that far from me. This would honestly be one of the worst things that could have possibly happened. Instead of being at this school where she's being treated and helped for her issues, or being with this Dr. Cott where she would be treated and helped with her issues. But now she's going to be off at this college with a bunch of other drugged out college kids. It's not going to be a helpful environment for her. It's going to do quite the opposite. It's probably going to make her fall deeper into addiction issues and probably get involved with a seedier crowd. So though this wasn't the best situation for Nancy, she was still excited to go out and experience college life. But that did not last very long, maybe a few short months. Because just after Thanksgiving, Nancy was busted for receiving stolen property. Apparently this group of kids that she got involved with up in Boulder, they weren't going to school there, they were just some locals. They were stealing skis from people and then storing them in Nancy's dorm room. Eventually, the police found out about it because they were doing some sort of undercover drug bust, and she had apparently approached an undercover officer trying to buy drugs. The police department was running this undercover operation and didn't want to blow it, so instead of busting Nancy, they just gave her an ultimatum. Either we can bust you, or you can just leave college, go back home, and we'll pretend like this never happened. So that's what she does. So this isn't a good situation for her at all. And she heads back home to live with her parents, and things had gotten way, way worse for Nancy. As her mom was going through some of her stuff, unpacking her college things, she sees a bunch of spoons and other paraphernalia that clue her into the fact that she was using black tar. And she's also got all these different drug dealer, drugged out friends that are coming in and out of her parents' house all the time. And she spends most of her time hanging out in Philadelphia, going to different rock shows, just, I don't know, grouping around with different rock bands and all these different drugged out guys. Of course, her parents are like, yeah, this is not going to work for us. Like, this is terrible. I don't want these people in our house, and honestly, the longer we let her stay, we're just enabling her. So they decide that the best thing for Nancy at this point is for her to get her own place. So that's exactly what they do. They get her an apartment in New York City, and they arrange for her to go do her own thing and basically start her adult life at the age of 16 years old. Nancy was stoked about this newfound freedom. She had spent her entire childhood with her parents, according to Deborah, basically fighting for control of the household, to the point where everybody in the household just did their best not to create conflict with her, but just let her do her thing and stay out of her way. Let her have control. So with her moving to New York City, she's going to have full control over everything. She's not going to have to worry about anybody. So she is elated. She's stoked to get out there and start this new life. When she gets to New York, she hits the ground running. She starts immersing herself in the music scene, hanging out at Max's Kansas City and CBGB, which are both like little music venues. They host some of the, underground music scene, but also a lot of the big bands that we know of now got their start and were playing at these venues. Nancy was hanging out with bands like Aerosmith, Blondie, the New York Dolls, the Heartbreakers, the Ramones, all kinds of amazingly huge bands, but at that time, they obviously weren't as big as they are now. For bands like this, they're not super big. The groupies that followed them around were basically on the same level. They likely partied together, likely did drugs together. That is essentially how Nancy figured out was the best way to make herself known and infiltrate these band networks. In order to support her own addiction, as well as supply these things for all these different band members she was trying to befriend, it was definitely getting expensive. And she was working different retail jobs in New York, but it wasn't paying quite what she needed. So, of course, she resorted to doing sex work, and this not only plunged her further into this underground underworld that's existing in New York City, but she's also able to afford more of this substance, and she's able to fall further and further into her addiction. One of the guys in the New York City punk scene that she was especially interested in was Jerry Nolan, who was the drummer and pioneer of the band the New York Dolls. But once that band broke up, he formed a new one called the Heartbreakers, and these guys were a lot more successful, a lot more symbiotic, but because they all struggled with different addiction issues, the band was never really seeing the success that they were looking for. That was until they got an invitation from Malcolm McLaren, who was the manager of the Sex Pistols over in the UK, to come over to the UK and play a tour. At this point in time, punk rock was not only becoming popular in the United States, it was also experiencing this massive explosion in the UK. With this interest in Jerry Nolan, and now being invited to the UK to go on this UK tour and link up with all these different punk bands that are over in London, Nancy just had this feeling that this was where music was going. This is where the new music explosion is going to be. And she also was just so interested in Jerry Nolan and wanted to follow him around with hopes that he's going to make it and I'll be there when he does. So it's said that Nancy continued to do sex work, but she also sobered up and got rid of all of her addictions so that she could save money and eventually go over to London and follow Jerry Nolan there, the ultimate groupie. But Jerry Nolan did not like Nancy. He was not very fond of her at all. In fact, most people really weren't. She had gotten the nickname Nauseating Nancy while she was in New York because she was just so brazen, she was so authentically herself, but she was also extremely obnoxious. She also didn't care what people thought about her. She was very open about the fact that she was doing sex work, and she was also very open about the fact that she was a serious addict.
First time I came across Nancy, I think Steve was shagging her in the toilet. I didn't like her.
Nancy was a hooker that was on the coattails of the New York Dolls.
I was dancing without any clothes on. You used to go down to the guys and dance in front of them and then get tips off them. And you do a little hand job, you know, for $10. They wanted to fuck. I just, you know, did it, you know. There wasn't really anything to it. I just give good blowjobs. That'll rip your balls off.
And she just made this reputation for herself that people just could not stand her, which is why they called her Nauseating Nancy. Now, talk about being at the right place at the right time, because the UK punk rock scene was exploding when Nancy headed over there. And when she got over there, she was invited to go to a party, and this is where she would actually get introduced to Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols. At this time, the Sex Pistols were the hottest punk band in the UK. In fact, they might have been the hottest punk band worldwide. They became the new image of anarchy, nihilism, complete rebellion, and just absolute anti-establishment views.
I'll take the queen, a fascist regime.
One of the most influential punk bands, for sure. They would spit on their audience, they would punch and kick at their audience, literally just show zero respect for the people that came to these shows. And that was all a part of the chaos. It was all a part of the act, the image. It was all a part of what it meant to be in the punk scene. Johnny Rotten was considered to be the voice of the punk scene, and that's because he was the frontman for the Sex Pistols. But truly, what everybody considered to be the actual embodiment of what punk stood for was Sid Vicious. He was just this dirty, grungy, talentless bassist for the Sex Pistols, but he was such a stage presence, he was such an icon, and everything that he represented just made the image of the band that much greater. So even though the music wasn't necessarily the focus, his image was able to boost up the music and boost up this movement because of just what he was able to represent and just how truly raw and crazy Sid Vicious really was. Initially, Nancy had her sights set on Johnny Rotten. She wanted to see if she could slide into those DMs, and in order to do that, obviously, she brought drugs. However, just like with the bands in the punk scene in New York City, Johnny Rotten wanted nothing to do with Nauseating Nancy.
It was like the weirdest thing. I never felt such a negative energy from someone. It was just a dark cloud with this bird, and I fucking hated her.
And that's because she was so loud, obnoxious, and he just wasn't attracted to her. But Sid had watched Nancy burn through nearly all of his bandmates with no luck. And ultimately, he felt super bad for her, so he decided to give her a chance. And from that point forward, Sid and Nancy were inseparable. Just like with my Kurt Cobain case, this one is full of information. Plus, we're talking about two separate people that kind of fuse into one story. So we're going to go ahead and call it for the week, and that is where we will leave off. We will pick up next week with Sid Vicious. So hopefully you guys enjoyed learning a little bit about Nancy Spungen and kind of her tumultuous, very crazy past. And it kind of gives you a little bit more understanding of who she was, this wild image that she has. And I think it gives you a little bit more empathy for where she came from. I do find Deborah's book and her account of what happened with Nancy to be, I would say, fairly accurate. I just feel like there's certain pieces that are very much embellished and very much dramatized in order to sell books. That's my personal opinion. I don't know that everything in there is made up, and it almost makes me wonder how truly awful all these doctors and psychiatrists were, because we're obviously only getting one side of the story. Regardless, I think we can safely say that Nancy at least struggled with some sort of mental health issues, and that was likely due to being medicated from an early age. In every story we talk about on this channel, those crucial years, 0 through 5, just seem to be so absolutely crucial to their development. And if any sort of trauma happens during that time frame, it's very likely to have lasting effects. But this story only gets crazier from here, you guys, so buckle up and get ready for next week for another one. But until then, sleep safe, stay sober, and keep it punk rock. Later, sobers.
Let's go.